Hello? Hello? There we go. All right, well, we are kind of continuing on this story of how the message is continuing to go out. Last week we talked about Peter and Cornelius, and now we're going to look at Paul and a whole new set of disciples. It's like the old group is kind of done, and back they're going to pretty much stay in Jerusalem, do their thing. But now we've got this new group of people with Paul who are going way beyond the borders of Judea and Samaria. The makeup of these new characters in this story begins to help us shape how the inclusiveness of the gospel really is. If we go back a chapter to chapter 13, we find out who all is traveling with Paul, and how these new disciples are going to be the front runners for expanding the gospel into the Gentile world. Of course, we have in our story today Paul and Barnabas. They are, of course, Jewish. But then we get also Simeon, who is also called Niger, meaning he was black, so likely from Africa. We get Lucius from Cyrene, also from North Africa. And then there was a man named Immanuel who had been a member of the court of Herod, so probably not seen as a good guy by most people. And yet, this is who is going out now to spread the good news of the gospel, and the ways in which the gospel is now going to open up the possibilities among those who had always been considered on the fringes, on the outside. It's really quite astounding, just the speed with which and the inclusiveness with which the gospel now is moving into new cultures. But what happens when the gospel goes into these new cultures, out into this Gentile world? I mean, here's the scene. You have Paul and Barnabas, rest of the entourage. They show up in Lystra, or what is present-day Turkey, and they perform these healing miracles. And the people are amazed and astounded because, well, this is the good news. This is what Jesus came to do. Jesus came to heal and to free. And they think that the gods have come down from heaven in human form and begin to prepare to make sacrifices to the gods that they know, which are Zeus, Hermes, believing that these disciples are the incarnations of these deities that they are familiar with. And Paul has to try and immediately correct this by going, no. I'm a human being. Barnabas is a human being. We're just like you. Don't worship us. This is a problem we tend to run into as humans, isn't it? How we try to make sense of the world in terms of what is familiar to us. How do I fit these acts, this miracle, these things that are going on that are completely new and completely different into the world I already understand? How do I make the gospel fit with where I am currently at? And that's part of the wonderful thing about the gospel, is it meets us exactly where we're at. What it doesn't do is it doesn't leave you where you're at. It's going to move you in some direction. And for these people, the familiar was their pantheon of gods. Their stories were the stories of Zeus coming down upon occasion in human form to interact with humanity. Now, granted, whenever Zeus did this, he was not exactly known as a benevolent god, so healing wasn't typically what he usually was doing, but this is still what they know. This is their understanding. Some time ago, I was challenging a parishioner on a stance that she had taken, and her response to me, I thought, was it was very spot on. And she said, "But that's what I was raised to believe. I have never known anything else. I've never known anything else." How true and spot on is that statement about how all of us tend to react when we're challenged or when something different is thrown at this. But this is what I've always known. the way I've always understood it. This is the way I understand the world. So how do you expect me to do, be, or believe something different? How can my heart and my mind be, I don't know, transformed by something new? Last week I talked about the changes within the Jewish community as the Gentiles were being brought in, how it was really this seismic shift and change in their culture and their worship, just in their worldview of how they were going about doing things, having to now work with people that they had been told were people they weren't supposed to be working with, but now are supposed to accept with open arms. Here we have a prime example of the difficulties that now not only the Jews were having, but the pagans are going to have as well. Here's what they have known their whole life. Their way of thinking, relating, and being was tied up in how they viewed the divine. Now, for the pagans, the notion of the gods coming down in human form, that was not a stretch. That was not the problem like they were having with Jewish communities. The problem with the pagans was not that God could not be human, it was that they were now confusing the creation with the creator. In particular, the instruments of God were getting confused with God. It's a whole different set of challenges. And as we move throughout our history, this isn't a challenge that goes away in Christianity, something we still struggle against, because we like to harness the gospel to the familiar, to things that maybe we shouldn't be melding it with. In particular, we begin to meld the gospel with ideas of exceptionalism, that maybe one group of people is somehow better than another group, rather than recognizing our common humanity. Whether it's my country is better than your country, my race is better than your race, my religion is better than yours. It's what we do. This gets played out very early on in the church as well. Paul's writing his letter to the Roman church, where apparently the Jews and the Gentiles are fighting over who's more in. Jews had an argument. Well, Jesus was a Jew. Of course, they were preferred. The Gentiles are sitting there going, yeah, but a lot of the Jewish community rejected Jesus. Now it's coming to us. It's now ours. Hence the seeds of early anti-Semitism are built. These Lystrans here that Paul is talking to in Acts, they're trying to paganize the gospel, trying to meld it with what they already know, trying to take the healing and the love and the freedom, and rather than let it be what it is, got to tie it to something. Much like it later is going to become tied to imperialized Christianity, later to colonialism, and the way in which Christian mission gets lived out. Even here in the United States, what we tend to do with it, we frequently confuse and meld being a follower of Jesus as being identical as our national identity. It's where we get notions of manifest destiny, or that God has specially blessed the United States over other countries. And this, of course, has led to things like justifying genocide, institutionalized slavery, setting up internment camps, rejecting refugees, or any other number of oppressive actions we take against people who might be what we view as a threat, might be a challenge, or pose a perceived threat to our own cultural identity. It's like Paul wandering in and telling these pagans, no, don't worship what you've always known. And we have a tendency to utilize the gospel to fit those notions and values we've been raised with, rather than allowing it to challenge those notions, those values, to be a check against sometimes our worst impulses instead of being something we use to validate our worst impulses. My general rule of thumb: the gospel transcends all worldly powers. It is about freedom. It is about love. My general rule of thumb is if you're harnessing the gospel to any form of worldly power, system, or structure, you are doing it wrong. Because worldly power systems are meant to divide us. It's what they do. They are meant to differentiate us from our fellow human beings, to tell us one group is somehow better than another group, that one group is somehow more worthy than another group, and to make us, well, gods over other people's lives. And Paul wants to reorient us to the reality of the gospel and the reality of our common humanity, of how we are separate from how God acts, how God behaves, who God chooses and goes to, of that common and basic standing before God, that nationalities and races and genders and social class mean nothing to God. Because Jesus came not to prop up those who are already powerful, but to lift up the lowly and the humble and the hungry and the poor and the sick. He levels the playing field. He destroys all of those worldly agendas that we like to impose upon our faith. And as Paul is going out, he is trying to convey that same leveling, that reorientation in how we view ourselves and God, and in relationship to God. That we are all, no matter where we come from, what gender you are, what beliefs you have held in the past, what color you are, that doesn't matter. We are all on equal footing. And he calls on us all to turn to the living God, who has created all people and all life. Because where you put your faith and your trust is imperative in terms of how we live together and treat one another, and how we view the gospel and what its purpose is in our world will dictate that as well. Stories like Paul's are not meant to be relegated to the annals of history as just a nice little story about the struggles of evangelism. They're meant to be spiritually inspiring stories that shape us, that transform us, that change us, and transform us to look around our culture and our world and say, whoa, wait a minute. This isn't Jesus. This isn't the gospel. This is me adhering to notions and values that the culture has always told me is what I should support. I've just always found ways to incorporate my faith into that already existing system, rather than allowing it to challenge me, to challenge my beliefs, to challenge my culture. And this is tough stuff. This is really tough stuff that Paul is embarking upon. And you might say, well, we're not making offerings to Zeus or anything. I'd challenge that. I'd say, aren't we? When we see God's activity in our midst, we might be tempted to fall at the feet of other cultural idols and gods within our society and offer them our allegiance instead of Christ and what Christ demands of us and tells us to go out and do. This week was a prime example. We had 2 more school shootings this week. 2 more. And we seem content to just do nothing about it. That this is just the price we have to pay. To continue to offer our children up as sacrifices to the gods of violence and bloodshed as simply a price that must be paid. And if that's the price that must be paid, what kind of God is demanding that? Because that's not the God who said, "Let me provide the sacrifice." And we keep making these offerings. We are doing what these pagans in Lystra did. We are not honoring the creator of all life. What did Paul do when he walked into this city? He healed. That is the work of God. And I wish I could say Paul's attempts here to reorient the people away from those idols was successful. Unfortunately, he and Barnabas get stoned and then dragged out and left for dead. Understandably so. So typically the reaction you get when you hear a message that requires a major change in idea, a major change in culture, and most people aren't ready for that. Pretty sure most of us aren't ready for that matter. Even today, are we really ready for the radical nature of the gospel that sets out to free us, to love, not to hate? A gospel that sends us out to be a healing balm, to bring life instead of death, to bring freedom instead of oppression, to give hope, not despair. Are we ready? Are we ready for that challenge? Are we ready for that gospel? Can we take that gospel and can we unhinge it? Unhinge it and say, "This is my God, and this is what my God is sending me to do." Let us pray.